2E was not met, and therefore the company does not qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement. As for any actions the company has taken to prevent the commission of similar acts or omissions, we've had public assurances from the new CEO that they have they've changed their corporate culture and they've brought in a bunch of new rules requiring that its new members behave in a manner that is more ethical. But I have no evidence to prove that. And the only way to know for sure is if the company goes on for a prolonged period without any repeat of the copious examples of corruption in which it has engaged systematically over the last 2 decades. F, did the organization identified SNC-Lavalin? Did they identify or express a willingness to identify any person involved in the wrongdoing related to the act or omission? The answer is no, they did not. They did not. In fact, the wrongdoers, as I pointed out earlier, had to be caught by Swiss authorities. And only after that occurred did they get a conviction and did those individuals pay a price. So it was not some act of virtue by SNC-Lavalin that led the company, that led to the prosecution of the wrongdoers in this case, not even close. So once again, the prosecutor was absolutely right when she said the company did not meet criteria F in section 715 of the Criminal Code, which asked whether or not the organization had identified or expressed willingness to identify any person involved in wrongdoing related to the act or omission in question. The next criteria that the prosecutor is asked to evaluate: whether the organization or any of its representatives was convicted of an offense or sanctioned by a regulatory body, or whether it entered into previous remediation agreement or other settlement in Canada or elsewhere for similar acts or omissions. In other words, is this an isolated incident? Did SNC-Lavalin simply make a small mistake once, and for God's sakes, can't we all make a mistake from time to time? Mr. Speaker, is this an isolated incident? I don't, even in the 6 hours that I have left, I don't have time to chronicle all of the proven corruption in which this company has engaged over the years. We would have to go too far back in history and travel too many years to the present in order for all of its crimes to be listed on the floor of this House of Commons. This company has officials who've been convicted or pled guilty to bribery in relation to the Jacques Cartier Bridge. Once again, bribery in relation to the McGill Health Centre. Did the Prime Minister, by the way, when he was working so hard to get the company off these charges, insist that in exchange for the settlement that the company repay Canadian taxpayers for any wrongdoing in respect of the Jacques Cartier Bridge? Did he ask SNC to repay Quebec taxpayers for the bribery in respect of the McGill Health Centre? I suspect not, but those are just two examples. We have SNC officials who are accused of crimes in Mexico, in Panama, who've been charged in Switzerland, and of course in Libya. There are other examples I could list, but again, for lack of time, I will not at this moment. All of it to say, this organization and its representatives have a track record of criminality that would be hard to match anywhere in Canada, and competes with companies around the world for similar, for its prodigious criminal track record. Now, it says here that the prosecutor must also consider whether the organization or any of its representatives is alleged to have committed any other offenses, including those not listed in this part. And once again, of course, its representatives are accused, convicted, and have pled guilty to countless other serious crimes. I will not reiterate what I just said. Finally, the company has, the prosecutor is obliged to consider any other factor that he or she considers relevant, and I suspect the prosecutor did that very carefully. And she properly concluded, having looked at this criteria even more systematically than I have just now done, that the company did not qualify for a deferred prosecution agreement. That is probably why the Attorney General took one look at the Act in the Criminal Code and one look at the track record of the company accused and said that the Director of Public Prosecutions was absolutely right not to grant this company an exemption from charges by signing a deferred prosecution agreement. I wonder if anyone in the Prime Minister's office even bothered to read their own legislation when they made this relentless drive to convince or strong-arm the Attorney General to overrule her prosecutor. Now, Mr. Speaker, I note that the argument they used was one that they're not even allowed to make. In subsection 3 of this chapter of the Criminal Code, it says, if the organization is alleged to have committed an offense under Section 3 or 4 of the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act, which it is, the prosecutor must not consider national economic interest, the potential effects on relations with a state other than Canada, or the identity of the organization or individual involved. The government has claimed falsely that it was doing all this to protect jobs. Now, I have in previous interventions proven that was complete falsehood. I call it the jobs lie. They were not protecting a single solitary job except for perhaps the powerful executives at the company, but that otherwise the claim that this was a job protection plan by the Prime Minister is completely false. But even if it weren't, the Act in question is clear that the prosecutor cannot take into account national economic interest. In other words, such arguments ought never have been made in the first place, true or otherwise. And so, given the Act as it is written, it is impossible to imagine how the prosecutor or later the Attorney General would have concluded that this company was entitled to a deferred prosecution agreement. But I'm curious if there's any record anywhere that the Prime Minister's office tried to dispute the legality of the the director's or the Attorney General's position on this. In all the documents released, we now have some from our friend Gerald Butts, we see nothing about the criteria in the Act that would have justified giving the company a deferred prosecution agreement. I ask you, browse through the documents that Jerry Butts provided. These are supposed to exonerate him somehow and the Prime Minister. Did any of those documents show that the company was entitled to a deferred prosecution agreement because of the circumstances of the act or omission that forms the basis of the offense?
No.
Did those documents show the company was entitled to a deal because the nature and gravity of the act or omission was small, or that the impact of the victim on the victim was mild?
No.
No. Did Gerald Butts table any document or any information? Did Michael Wernick do the same, showing that the degree of involvement of the senior officers of the organization was so remote that the company was entitled to a deferred prosecution agreement? If they did, I sure as hell didn't see it. Did the government, any of its members, since this scandal erupted publicly in the last 2 months, show that the company qualified for a deferred prosecution agreement because they had made reparations to the Libyan people who were the victims of this fraud? Is there any evidence that the government can provide that the Libyan people have been made whole in the aftermath of this $130 million of theft?
None.
Did the government at any time present the House or the Justice Committee or the Attorney General in any of the evidence that we see that the company identified the wrongdoers and reported them to authorities before they got caught? Was there any evidence that the Prime Minister's office provided in order to argue that the company qualified for a deferred prosecution agreement because it self-reported the crime? Of course, there was no such evidence. Did the Prime Minister or the clerk or anyone else provide evidence to the Attorney General that the company should qualify for a special deal because under criteria G, neither the organization nor its representatives have ever been convicted or sanctioned by a regulatory body on similar charges? Did they ever provide evidence that the company should be entitled to a special deal because the individuals listed, or the organization listed in the offenses had already reported themselves in for their offenses? Was there any evidence on any of these criteria that SNC-Lavalin was entitled to a deferred prosecution?
No.
There was none. And yet, the Prime Minister and his team pushed and pushed and pushed in what Gerald Butts admitted was 20 meetings, phone calls, and text messages, a number that is probably an underestimation. 20 times, at least 20 times, the Prime Minister and his team would go back to the Attorney General again and again and again, and not once in any of those 20 occasions do we find evidence that they argued that the company was even entitled under the criteria in the law the government wrote to receive a settlement. So in other words, they were clearly doing something for which they had no legal grounding. And instead of acting in accordance with the law, we have text messages proving that Gerald Butts had cooked up a scheme whereby they would get a pre-cooked legal opinion to try and justify letting this liberal-linked corporation off the hook. Now, if that does not defeat, pervert, or obstruct the course of justice, I don't know what does. That brings us from the past to the present and the future. We now know that in the past, from December through to the Attorney General's removal in January, the Prime Minister orchestrated this massive campaign. It's all documented. It's all proven. But what about the future? Everyone's forgetting about the future. When the Liberal member across the way yelled It's over now. I wish it were, but the door is open. The current Attorney General has said he may still grant a deferred prosecution to SNC-Lavalin, that he is open to directing the top prosecutor to negotiate such a settlement.
Unacceptable. Shame.
And furthermore, we have looked at the sections of the Director of Public Prosecutions Act, and while it is clear that direction from the Attorney General to the prosecutor must be published in the Gazette, such publication can be delayed if the Attorney General believes it's necessary. In other words, it now remains a possibility that the Prime Minister will attempt to force through such a negotiation without Canadians immediately finding out. I think it's possible that this Prime Minister is now hatching a scheme that he will quietly plan right now to grant this settlement to SNC-Lavalin in a way that will only become public after the next election. Imagine that. After all we've been through, after the brazen interference in the legal system that we've already witnessed, the Prime Minister still will not rule out the possibility that this company will get a settlement instead of go to trial. Now, some might say, well, that's just an opposition allegation. You know, how can you prove that? Well, of course, we can't prove what someone is going to do in the future, but if he weren't, it's a pretty easy way for him to prove it. He could stand in the House today and say, the top prosecutor has made her decision. The company does not deserve a settlement, it deserves a trial. We respect the prosecutor's decision. It is final, and our government, including our Attorney General, will do absolutely nothing to overturn it. But so far, he has not stood in the House of Commons and said that. Rather, he has allowed his Attorney General to take the public position, contrary to his predecessor, that said agreement is still a possibility. In other words, we could be standing here if, God forbid, the Prime Minister is re-elected. Before Christmas, we could learn that the Prime Minister has granted a special deal to SNC-Lavalin, allowing it to avoid trial in the case of fraud and bribery. And this is very much an open question. Canadians who have followed this scandal breathlessly for 2 months obviously are interested in the answer to that question. And they should have it before the next election. I can state with certainty that the leader of the Conservative Party, as Prime Minister of Canada, will not direct or in any way influence his future Attorney General to hand SNC-Lavalin a deal. He has said, and so I can restate, that he will not interfere with the work of an Attorney General or of a top prosecutor.
Professional doing their job.
Because even if you believe that a deferred prosecution agreement should exist in the criminal code, something we never really had a chance to debate because it was buried in a massive omnibus budget bill, you ought to at least believe that granting one is the exclusive decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions, who is an independent and separate agent of the legal system that has the authority to act with an independent frame of mind to make the right decision. Any future Conservative government much like previous Conservative governments, will always respect the sacrosanctity of prosecutorial independence. In fact, and you know, it's funny, most Liberal members have been hanging their head in shame for most of my speech as I roll out one devastating fact after another. But now, all of a sudden, when I restate that that a Conservative government will not grant a special deal to SNC-Lavalin, they start screaming and hollering. They come unglued. It's like they're more outraged by the possibility that SNC-Lavalin will go to trial for its alleged fraud and bribery than they are about the conduct of their own Prime Minister. I wish they had been screaming and hollering a few minutes ago when I was laying out all of the evidence of how the Prime Minister's top advisors interfered with a criminal prosecution, but they were dead silent. They just sat there in disgrace. But the second they find out that a future Conservative government will let the legal course of action run independently and that SNC-Lavalin will be made to answer for itself before trial, that is a lot. That is too far. It is too much. They can't handle it, and they erupt in screams and hollers, Mr. Speaker. That says an awful lot about the things that matter to this Liberal government. I think you will agree.
Point of order, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. He'd like to rise on a point of order. Yes, Mr. Speaker. Canadians have seen for the past 2 days that the member for Carleton has provided an excellent explanation. And when we're faced with these facts, we hear people from across the aisle screaming against the facts. These facts are the very basis of the argument and the political debate that we need to have in a respectful manner in this House of Commons. So, Mr. Speaker, I would ask you to remind all members that when an MP has the floor and he's exposing facts and providing evidence and is tabling documents and other people refuse this, all this has to happen in a respectful and cordial atmosphere, and particularly if they have something to say, they will have the time to do so later, but Canadians will judge their behaviour on October 21st. I'd like to thank the honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent for his intervention. Usually, I proceed carefully with regard to the decorum. As the member has indicated, we do mention this, and we need to have decorum for debate in the House, and I'm going to continue to observe decorum. And when noise levels become too high, I will interrupt to lower the noise here in the House. The honourable member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, point of order, just to correct what I said. I've been informed. I said October 24th. I'm sorry if I did say this. I would like to excuse myself. It is October 21st that the people will be voting. That's not really a point of order under normal circumstances. So now I'm going to expect the continuation of debate. The honourable member for Carleton.
This brings me to the next part of my presentation. According to the CBC's article that was just published in the last 24 hours about the conditions that the former Attorney General allegedly brought to the Prime Minister in order to put an end to the public controversy that has been raging, the final one was that the Prime Minister admit, I'm quoting now, publicly or to caucus that his office acted inappropriately in its attempts to convince her to consider granting SNC-Lavalin a deferred prosecution agreement. Now, the Prime Minister apparently considered this a demand he was not prepared to fulfill. He thought that she was in no position to tell him he was wrong. He's the boss around here. He doesn't take responsibility for anything. And that, of course, has been the story of his life. You know, he inherited a massive, what he calls a family fortune from his grandfather. That family fortune had been for over a decade in a trust fund, a testamentary trust fund that is the income from which is sheltered from personal income taxes, and therefore he was able to avoid paying the same rate of taxation that another Canadian would pay on earned income for the growth in that trust fund. This was called the testamentary trust fund loophole, and it existed up until the beginning of 2015 when the loophole was closed. I will note that there was the former Harper government that closed that loophole, and the then Liberal leader opposed the Prime Minister's decision, the Harper's decision to do that, and I believe stood in the House of Commons and actually voted against closing the loophole that he profited from. Wow. We have to do some thinking about whether or not we need to change the ethics laws to prevent members from using their vote in this House of Commons to profit themselves, or at least to take positions on issues for which they clearly have a real conflict of interest, if not one that is captured in law. But nevertheless, because he has inherited this great family fortune, he's never had to live with the consequences of his own decisions, and he was not prepared to do so in this case either. The former Attorney General had asked him to stand up and say it was wrong to badger, hound, threaten, pressure, and interfere in the criminal prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. And according to this story, if he had done that along with the other conditions, she might have stayed in caucus and continued to work with the Liberal government. And though the Prime Minister apparently considered apologizing, it was widely reported that he would apologize. He showed up in a press conference and put on another high school drama production, which is an extension of his earlier profession, and avoided taking any personal blame or responsibility for his actions. It was at that press conference, I note in passing, that he stated the blatant falsehood that the former Attorney General had never once raised any concerns with him about his interference in the file. But I digress. So he did not take responsibility. I think that says something about him and about the kind of leader he is versus what he promised he would be. He promised he was going to be the great Prime Minister of reconciliation, that he was going to do things completely differently. He would usher in a new era of idealism, and that Canadians could take him at his word. That would involve taking responsibility for one's own failures. When he didn't do so, he proved that he has failed to live up to the expectations he deliberately and meticulously set in the last election. Furthermore, by trying to blame the first female Indigenous Attorney General for his own behavior, he proved that what many have long suspected, that his talk about reconciliation has been nothing more than drama and theater. Yes, we know he's given sobbing speeches, he's acted with great symbolism. We know that he can put on a show for the cameras. That's what he did as a drama teacher. He acted. But there's a difference between acting and action. And actions speak louder than words. So let me just examine the approach that this Prime Minister has taken to using First Nations people for his own political objectives. I quote from the Rolling Stone magazine. And the magazine's reporter asked a question about his boxing match with Patrick Brazeau, the now senator in the upper chamber. Notice the descriptive language that the Rolling Stone reports after he was asked about that question. The Prime Minister, it writes, mischievously smiled when I asked how much of the boxing match had been planned out. It was not random, he says. I wanted someone who would be a good foil. We stumbled upon the scrappy, tough guy senator from an Indigenous community. He fit the bill. It was a very nice counterpoint. The Prime Minister says this with the calculation of a CFO in a company budget markup session. Quote, I saw it as the right kind of narrative, the right story to tell, he says. Let's just capture that again. I wanted someone who would be a good foil. And we stumbled upon the scrappy, tough guy senator from an Indigenous community. He fit the bill. And it was a very nice counterpoint. The Prime Minister said, with the calculation of a CFO in a company budget markup session, I saw it as the right kind of narrative, the right kind of story. Exactly what I said earlier. A drama teacher putting on a production, telling a story about his grandeur at the expense of a so-called scrappy, tough guy from an Indigenous community. But you know what's much more disgusting is what he was since caught on tape saying. And I'll share it with the House. And wanting to shame Mr. Brazeau, the scrappy, tough guy from the Indigenous community, the Prime Minister cut his hair, which was part of the bet at the outcome of the boxing match. And I'm going to quote the Prime Minister here. We're both known for our hair on the Hill. Let's say the loser gets a haircut, the Prime Minister said of the bet, adding to Brazeau that Brazeau resisted back a little bit, pointing out that hair has a cultural significance for First Nations people. And I said, I know. That's why I proposed it. When a warrior cuts his hair, it's a sign of shame. So it's very apropos. That's the Prime Minister of Reconciliation. Let me read that again. Prime Minister added that Brazeau resisted a little bit the haircut bet, pointing out that hair has a cultural significance for First Nations peoples. And the Prime Minister said, I know. That's why I proposed it. When a warrior cuts his hair, it's a sign of shame. So it's very apropos. Just digest that a little bit. Yes. He didn't just want to win the boxing match. He wanted to do it against an Indigenous person. And then he wanted to cut his hair because it was a cultural symbol of shame, of him dominating over that person, of him humiliating that person. Now put aside whether or not Mr. Brazeau agreed to participate in the fight, he did. But it is the pleasure with which the Prime Minister embraced this opportunity to shame someone on the basis of their cultural traditions. That is the Prime Minister. That is the heart of the so-called reconciliation Prime Minister. And this is not lost on First Nations leaders. Let me quote from an interview by Mercedes Stephenson. Joining me now to discuss this referring now to the affair with SNC-Lavalin, is Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. Grand Chief, you had a chance to see that video, and she was talking about a video in relationship to the scandal. What did you make of it? Grand Chief Phillip says, well, it was deeply disappointing to know and understand at this late date in the game that the vision and the promises of the Prime Minister that were announced in the October 2015 have not come to pass. All of the promises and the commitments that he made have simply been set aside, and now that he's under tremendous pressure from the former Attorney General on the SNC-Lavalin issue, the Prime Minister is really revealing himself to be who he really is, which is a very self-centered, conceited, arrogant individual. And I think that was demonstrated with his very smug, mean-spirited response to the Grassy Narrows demonstrator. That situation is incredibly tragic. Many, many people have died. Many people...
Just a reminder to the honourable member of Carleton, when we're using citations to make references to other members in the House, be they ministers or other members, the usual practice is to not do something through a citation that a member would be not permitted to do in the usual spirit of decorum and civil discourse in the House. And so I would encourage him to perhaps, if there's language in the citation that might sort of fit in that category, he may wish to either rephrase it or perhaps skip over that part of the citation. I thank the honourable member for Carleton, and we'll resume debate.
Yes, I will. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I will restart the quote then and I will properly ascribe pronouns and titles in place of personal names. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip. He is the Grand Chief of, I believe, the Union of First Nations in British Columbia. And he says of the Prime Minister, well, it was very deeply disappointing to know and understand that at this late date in the game, that the vision and promises of the Prime Minister that he announced in October 2015 have not come to pass. All of the promises and commitments that he made have simply been set aside, and now that he's under tremendous pressure from the former Attorney General, the SNC-Lavalin issue, the Prime Minister is really revealing himself to be who he really is, which is a very self-centered, conceited, arrogant individual. And I think that was demonstrated with his very smug, mean-spirited response to the Grassy Narrows demonstrator. That situation is simply tragic. Many, many people have died. Many people are handicapped and living with the legacy of mercury poisoning. And, you know, he's such an arrogant individual. It's very disturbing and very disappointing, end quote. Now, that respected chief was referring to the Prime Minister's disgusting comment at a recent $1,500 a ticket fundraiser, where he was speaking to a bunch of well-connected liberal lobbyists and wealthy donors, and a courageous whistleblower stood up and warned him about an issue of mercury poisoning in an Aboriginal community. And he had the audacity to laugh about the incident and say, thank you for your donation. And then he said again, thank you for your donation to the Liberal Party of Canada. He actually said it twice. And of course, the millionaire Liberals in the room burst into uproarious laughter, thinking it was just hilarious as she was being dragged out by security, that he would make a joke at the expense of the people suffering from mercury poisoning on a First Nations reserve and say, thank you for your donation. Yep. You know, isn't it nice that he and his wealthy friends can gather together and luxuriate at a beautiful reception with fine wine and other delicious liqueurs that they can enjoy in the comfort and safety of a place where the water is not poisoned by mercury, but that, God forbid, someone should stand up and confront him when he thinks no one's looking because he didn't know he was on camera, and the real Prime Minister reveals himself when he's not the drama teacher we all see on television. Mercedes Stevenson then asked, the Prime Minister did apologize for his tone and what he said in that video. I take it that that apology doesn't mean much to you. The response from the chief, no, you know, I think it was this late stage in this game. Again, we're used to the Prime Minister's apologies and alligator tears. It's not about apologies, it's about getting it right. I think the chief made a very good point there, the Grand Chief, excuse me, when he talked about the Prime Minister's alligator tears, because the Prime Minister has substituted his ability to generate these phony tears on demand for real action on behalf of the people, the First Nations people. They weren't looking for more water to pour out of his eyeballs. They were looking for fresh water and clean water that they could drink on reserve. And he didn't provide any of that. Instead, he provided a disgusting display of mockery against those same people. Mercedes Stevenson, how would you describe the relationship between the government and Indigenous communities under the Prime Minister compared to previous governments? Well, I think it started off with a great sense of hope and anticipation that the Prime Minister and his government was going to embrace the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the TRC calls to action were going to be fully implemented. That there was going to be a seismic change with respect to our jurisdictional issues and the other issues around energy in this country. And as time has moved forward, all of those promises have simply swept aside and have not come to pass. And here we are, 6 months out from the next election, and we're faced with the Prime Minister's government totally unraveling, coming apart at the seams. And without question, the sun is setting on this Prime Minister. Mercedes Stevenson goes on, do you think it's that the government isn't committed to reconciliation, or that it's simply much more difficult than we were anticipating, and it takes more time and more effort to solve what are some very complex problems? The Grand Chief, well, quite honestly, I think that the clip that we witnessed, the most disturbing part of that clip, aside from the smugness and mean-spirited remark on the part of the Prime Minister, was the spontaneous applause from Liberal Party members who were attending, which to me is a reflection on the heart and soul of the Liberal Party, which for many, many decades had this arrogant sense of entitlement, that they were a national party that is so accustomed to forming government, and I think that's the central issue here. The Prime Minister paid a lot of lip service, you know, to this historic change, to this historic changes, but I don't think the party itself was, you know, that much in support of those visionary statements made by the Prime Minister in the early days of his tenure. So then Ms. Stevenson asked the Grand Chief about the former Attorney General, and he said, and asks, is it because you're upset with what happened there, or is it also because the government's not meeting its promises that you feel that they put out there? It's both, replied the Grand Chief. But believe me, British Columbians, the Indigenous community in British Columbia, we're so proud of the former Attorney General. We were so proud when the former Attorney General was appointed as Justice Minister. We have had the privilege and honor of working with her, and we know her to be deeply committed, very conscientious, and an absolute workhorse. And she's very meticulous in terms of preparation and keeping records of meetings and so on and so forth. And we knew immediately that the efforts to smear the former Attorney General were politically motivated, and needless to say, we were deeply angered by how terribly she was treated as an Indigenous woman. When the Prime Minister said there was nothing more dear to him than relationships with Indigenous peoples, and in a very misleading way, has always held himself as a feminist, end quote. And of course, then Ms. Stevenson finishes up the interview. I encourage anyone to go watch the Grand Chief's words, and they will find them very revealing indeed about the Prime Minister's true motivations and his true character in respect of the issue of reconciliation. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Prime Minister's decision to trample all over the will of First Nations peoples in the approval or rejection of pipelines. First Nations people supported the Northern Gateway Pipeline. It was a wonderful opportunity for northern British Columbian First Nations communities to generate billions of dollars for schools and hospitals and thousands of jobs for young people who are bursting with potential but lack opportunity to fulfill it. You think of the Aboriginal population of the country is the youngest of any demographic. And so we have this spectacular opportunity for Canada to address its aging population and retiring workforce by expanding opportunity to young First Nations people to take on excellent jobs of the future. And many of those jobs, good, high-paying jobs, will be in natural resource sectors. Building pipelines, pipe fitting, welding, operating heavy machinery to install those pipelines. And of course, rightfully collecting royalties from the resulting economic wealth these projects generate. One thing that a lot of people who oppose natural resource projects don't realize is their potential to pay royalties to the rightful owners of the land, in many cases, First Nations communities. That's why energy companies regularly sign agreements to not only pay revenue directly to First Nations governments that can be used to build schools and hospitals and clinics and other services, but also to employ the young, youthful workforce in those communities. And so let me start with the Northern Gateway Pipeline, which the Prime Minister vetoed, even though it had already been approved, and even though the majority of First Nations communities on the pathway of the pipeline had supported it. Many of them had benefit agreements that they had signed with the company Enbridge in order to share in the prosperity that would come from that project. It is a constitutional obligation to consult with First Nations people when their interests are directly affected by a natural resources project in or around their lands. That happened in the case of the Northern Gateway. And the project was approved. The Prime Minister ran in the last election, though, on killing the project because he wanted to take advantage of a hardcore anti-development agenda that was popular with the far-left base of his party in certain parts of the country. He also wanted to take advantage of the copious foreign dollars that were pouring in to Canada to influence the outcome of the last election against resource development. And we now know why these foreign interests don't want Canadian resources to get to market, because they're profiting from keeping Canada landlocked in its oil and gas sector. Why? Because Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Venezuela, and numerous other foreign producers of oil don't want to have to compete with Canada. One easy way to prevent that competition is to block the construction of pipelines to tide water. That, in other words, as a result of the fact that we cannot expand our pipeline network to the east and west coasts, we ultimately have to sell 99% of our oil exports to the United States of America, which is the other foreign interest. The refineries south of the border profit from buying Canada's oil at 40 and 50% price discounts and then selling it to the world market at full price. So they buy from Canada at $20 and sell to the world at $50, and they pocket the difference. No wonder these foreign interests don't want Canada to have pipelines. So there's now been documented millions upon millions of dollars that poured into Canada through various forms of internet advertising to dissuade people from supporting pro and development politicians and ultimately electing an anti-development government. But the victims of that political agenda, which the Prime Minister deliberately played into, have been First Nations people. Let me read from an article in the Financial Post entitled, "We are very disappointed. Loss of Northern Gateway devastating for many First Nations chiefs say. Most, I'm quoting still, most Aboriginal communities in northern BC impacted by the pipeline supported the $7.9 billion project and are angry the Prime Minister rejected it, say leaders from 3 of the bands." I'm going to continue reading. This is on April the 10th, 2017, Financial Post. Most Aboriginal communities in northern British Columbia impacted by the Northern Gateway pipeline supported the $7.9 billion project and are angry the Prime Minister rejected it, say representatives of 3 bands. Elmer Ghostkeeper of the Buffalo Lake Métis Settlement, Chief Elmer Derrick of the Gitxsan Nation, and Dale Swampy of the Samson Cree Nation said on the sidelines of a private meeting in Calgary on Friday with oil patch leaders they are disappointed in the, quote, political decisions which they say was made without their input. Let's stop there for a second. The Prime Minister claims to support the constitutional obligation of consulting with First Nations people on resource projects. But does that consultation only go ahead with those who oppose development? What about consulting those communities who are the majority that support the development? Do they not have the constitutional right to be consulted by their government? Well, in that case, I would challenge the Prime Minister to tell me how many First Nations communities who had benefit agreements in the Northern Gateway pipeline did he meet with and consult personally before he vetoed the project? The article goes on. Again, I'm reading from the Financial Post from April of 2017, Claudia Catania. Quote, "They are now looking for ways to generate new development. Ghostkeeper said more than 20 of the 42 bands of the Alberta to West Coast pipelines right-of-way were looking forward to sharing in the construction and long-term benefits. Their expectations were really raised with a promise of $2 billion set aside in the business and employment opportunities, Ghostkeeper said before addressing the Canadian Energy Executive Association at the Calgary Petroleum Club. Quote, energy was offered to Alberta communities, and with the change in government, that was all taken away. We are very disappointed in this young government," end quote. Ghostkeeper said he'd like to see an oil pipeline revived, but led by Aboriginals. Quote, we have to partner with the oil and gas industry and be treated as equals, not as tokens, because any natural resource project that is going to take place on traditional lands has to be given free, informed, and prior consent. The old ways of doing business doesn't cut it, end quote. I continue to quote from the story. Derrick said his band was supportive of it from the outset, but the Prime Minister didn't want to hear from supportive communities. Quote, "The fact that the Prime Minister chose not to consult with people in in BC disappointed us very much," he said. Still quoting from the article, Swampy said some of the bands are discussing legal action against the federal government for rejecting the project without proper consultation. They understand, I'm quoting now, they understand that it was a political decision and not a decision acting in the best interest of Canadians, said Swampy. They weren't asked about the financial effect, the lost employment. They were trying to get themselves out of poverty, the welfare system that they are stuck to. And every time they try to do something like that, it's destroyed. Now let me just repeat that. For the self-righteous anti-development types, such as the Prime Minister, who consistently block these resource projects. Let me quote again from this First Nations leader. He says of the local Indigenous communities that wanted this project, they weren't asked about the financial effect, the lost employment. They are trying to get themselves out of poverty, the welfare system that they are stuck to. And every time they try to do something like that, it's destroyed. And that was the effect of the Prime Minister's personal decision to veto the Northern Gateway pipeline. I go on, quoting the article. Saying the Great Bear, quote, the Great Bear Rainforest is no place for a pipeline and the Douglas Channel is no place for a oil tanker traffic, the Prime Minister killed the Northern Gateway last November. Enbridge Inc., the Enbridge Inc. project had received regulatory approval, as well as approval from the previous Conservative government, after a decade of planning and more than $500 million of spending. I mean, think about that. First Nations, entrepreneurs, and the previous Harper government consulted, studied, examined the ecological and economic impacts for a decade. The company spent $500 million on that process. And yet after the Independent Energy Board concluded it was in the public interest and it was environmentally safe, the Prime Minister politically interfered and overturned the decision without consulting with the communities on First Nations that had supported it and counted on it as their best hope to escape poverty. I go on. Prime Minister also imposed a ban on tanker traffic on the northern BC coast while approving Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline expansion and the upgrading of Enbridge's Line 3. I'll stop quoting right here. Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain pipeline. Right. Prime Minister claims he's approved that. Not a single shovel is in the ground all these years later. Not a single inch of steel has been added in pipeline to the Kinder Morgan project. It has been entangled in political obfuscation now for years, even though it must be the least controversial actual project in the history of pipelines. Because they're not even seeking a new right-of-way. The pipeline is already there. They're simply looking to twin it so that its capacity can go from the existing 300,000 to 900,000. So far, the Prime Minister has bought the old pipeline, but done nothing to build the new pipeline. The courts have found that once again, he failed to properly consult First Nations communities along the route of the Kinder Morgan project, and has, as a result, had to go back to the drawing board and start all over. And in the process, he has moved as slowly as possible. Do nothing in a mile that can be done in a yard. Do nothing in a yard that can be done in a foot. Do nothing in a foot that can be done in an inch. And so the process inches along. Prime Minister giving vague reassurances that someday, one day, steel will be in the ground and we will begin building this project on which he's already spent $4.5 billion in exchange for nothing we didn't already have. We know his real agenda, though. He is going to get through the next election by trying to convince Canadians who poll shows support pipelines that he does too. And if he gets back in, there will be no pipeline built, just like there hasn't been for the last 3.5 years, because he is ideologically opposed to energy development. He said so. He said he wants to phase out the oil sands. Those were his words. And he is succeeding. By blocking the 3 pipelines that were ready to go when he took office, Trans Mountain, Northern Gateway, and Energy East, He's landlocked the industry, put 100,000 people out of work, and as I was just saying, has attacked the interests and the autonomy of the Indigenous communities. I was there quoting from the Financial Post in April of 2017. Now, similar groups are coming forward to demand an end to the Prime Minister's tanker ban. You know, the Prime Minister claims he supports pipelines. Right. How are you going to get the oil from the coast to Asia if you're banning tankers? Does he have some magical petroleum-carrying unicorn that is capable of lifting up the oil and taking it to foreign markets? If there is a tanker ban, how could it possibly get where it's going? And so, and I'm quoting right out of the National Post on this, First Nations Coalition calls for rejection of Liberal tanker ban. One group plans to file UN complaint. End quote. So now we have First Nations that are considering going to the UN to fight against the Prime Minister's policies, anti-development policies that keep them in poverty. Quote, the coalition has sketched out plans to build a roughly $18 billion oil pipeline from northern Alberta to around Prince Rupert, BC. The coalition of First Nations groups is imploring Ottawa to rein in an oil tanker ban on the northern BC coast, with one organization planning to level a United Nations complaint against the government to protest the legislation. The plea is a last-ditch effort to reverse Bill C-48 as it nears passage through the Senate. The coalition, composed of the National Coalition of Chiefs, the Indian Resource Council, and the Eagle Spirit Chiefs Council, met with a number of senators Tuesday morning in Ottawa to oppose the moratorium. Calvin Helen, who led the talks with senators, is the CEO of Eagle Spirit Energy Holding, which has sketched out plans to build a roughly $18 billion oil pipeline from northern Alberta to around Prince Rupert, BC. Helen, Alex Qualam BAM member, has long pitched the idea as as Canada's sole First Nations-led pipeline. Helen said C-48 is a matter of enormous concern for the roughly 200 First Nations communities represented by the coalition, and said the Prime Minister's tanker ban explicitly targets the project, effectively stripping Indigenous people of their economic self-determination. Is this what reconciliation is supposed to represent in Canada, he asks. Is that what reconciliation looks like? Then when a group of ambitious and smart and industrious First Nations people come forward with an $18 billion project that could lift whole communities out of the long-term poverty in which they've been trapped and give them full independence and control over their own destiny, that the Prime Minister comes forward with a bill banning them from doing so. Is that what he meant by reconciliation? That is the question that this band member asks as he speaks out against the tanker ban. Because the tanker ban is not just about blocking big oil companies from moving their product, it's about blocking these communities from their one chance to escape poverty. And if the Prime Minister believed half as much in reconciliation as he does in his great dramatic and theatrical productions on the subject, then he would consult with and listen to these First Nations people. I asked members of the government, what did he say to Mr. Helen when he put forward C-48, the tanker ban? Did he look him in the eye and tell him that generations of First Nations people in Western Canada will have to be held back because this government is blocking them from achieving economic independence through resource development? Or did he even meet with them at all? My suspicion is that he couldn't be bothered. If there was no camera nearby and no photo opportunity to carry out, then he simply couldn't be bothered to show up for reconciliation. Helen's comments, the article goes on, come amid intense angst in Alberta, which has failed for many years to build the necessary pipelines to carry away steadily increasing oil sands production. The Eagle Spirit Chiefs Council said Tuesday it would file a complaint in coming days under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, against the federal government. I'll stop on this point. Now, there's much legitimate debate about whether the declaration is the best way to achieve reconciliation with First Nations people. But the Prime Minister gave plenty of lip service to that declaration before the last election. And now he appears to have violated it in his tanker ban that prevents First Nations from achieving the economic independence that they have worked so hard to achieve. The article goes on, quoting again from the National Post. The chief said the ban unfairly restricts oil exports to the First Nations group, while allowing multinational corporations to ship their products from the southern portion of the BC coast. So here we go again. Large multinational corporations will continue to ship their product. So this is not even about stopping the shipment of oil and gas. It's just about stopping Canadians from shipping their product. This Prime Minister would never contemplated banning oil tankers from the East Coast arriving at the East Coast. All of those East Coast tankers, they come right across the Atlantic, one tanker after another, into the eastern coast of our country, shipping foreign oil to Canadian markets. And as that oil comes in, our money goes out, and we get poorer and poorer. No wonder our trade deficit is approaching record highs. Now, let me quote further from that National Post article. Quote, "All we're trying to do is take advantage of the resources available to us," said former Chief Wallace Fox, chairman of the Indian Resource Council, a part of the coalition. The Eagle Spirit Pipeline appears to present a conundrum on Indigenous rights. A handful of First Nations communities, including the Yinka Dene Alliance, which oppose the other pipelines in BC, have opposed the project in part due to environmental worries. Meanwhile, a host of Indigenous communities along the pipeline route support Eagle Spirit, while saying it will give them more financial independence. Helen said he is close to a consensus among First Nations on Eagle Spirit. He said much of the First Nations opposition to the pipeline comes from Indigenous people backed by activist organizations who claim to speak for whole communities, but do not. I continue to quote from the National Post there, Mr. Speaker. And so the story goes on and on and on. Prime Minister